Today we get to talk about the history of mental illness. This is going to have a few more videos than usual, simply because sometimes it's easier to show than to tell, and other people have done a lot more work than I have in this area, and there are some excellent documentaries out there. Unfortunately, some of them are far too big for me to put in any of this video, so I'm going to try to create a playlist that collects some of the best options. Your first question here is, what is mental illness? Are there mental abnormalities that aren't illness? And what causes these mental abnormalities? People are usually quick to judge any form of abnormality as being mentally ill. Despite this, there are a lot of mental abnormalities that simply aren't illness. Having a higher than average IQ is technically an abnormality. But yet, is that really a mental illness? Now, it may be correlated to other mental illnesses, but it, in and of itself, is in fact not one. There are a lot of things that could cause any of these mental issues, and we're going to get to those in a bit. Additionally, because there are so many mental issues out there, different cultures do see an awful lot of these in different ways, and have found different ways of deciding what the cause is, deciding what the diagnosis is, deciding what the treatment is. For example, in some cultures, mental abnormalities are actually potentially a very good sign. For anybody who's ever read the book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. That is a book about a person with epilepsy. Granted, that is not necessarily a mental illness in this situation, but it is certainly a mental abnormality, a neurologic abnormality, but in that person's culture, they were considered a form of shaman. And there are a lot of cultures that have very different views of what these mental illnesses really are. So I come up with a TED Talk that discusses, of course, a lot of the things that are going on both in the United States, but also how other cultures sometimes see mental illnesses as well. So we're going to go to that now. But first, sorry about that, completely forgot this was the next slide. First, your joke. A man is walking past an insane asylum. As he passes the yard, which was surrounded by a high fence, he heard many voices from within chanting, 7, 7, 7, over and over again. He's very curious as to why the patients could be chanting this number, so he looks through a gap in the fence planks to have a look. Before he can see anything, someone on the other side pokes him in the eye with a stick. The man walks away muttering angrily while the patients start chanting, 8, 8, 8. Okay. So I guess your lesson learned? Don't stick your eye up against a fence hole. So next should be the video. Whew.
I've had the incredible opportunity to visit tribal and indigenous communities around the world. And while I was there, I would often run into these individuals that would go into these trance-like states to act as healers or seers in their community. And these are the people that we call shaman. And I was surprised to learn that so many of them were identified in childhood by having what we would call a psychotic break. They were either hearing voices, having visions. It came along with some sort of mental emotional turmoil, and typically they were taken aside by an older shaman and told that this was a calling, and it was a calling for them to begin to develop their very unique and powerful sensitivities. And then they would be mentored. So this was all very fantastic and interesting to me, but it took on a whole new level of significance when I met this young man 4 years ago named Adam.
I was always just very excited. I was just the happy kid.
I've had the incredible opportunity to visit tribal and indigenous communities around the world. And while I was there, I would often run into these individuals that would go into these trance-like states to act as healers or seers in their community. And these are the people that we call shaman. And I was surprised to learn that so many of them were identified in childhood by having what we would call a psychotic break. They were either hearing voices, having visions. It came along with some sort of mental emotional turmoil, and typically they were taken aside by an older shaman and told that this was a calling, and it was a calling for them to begin to develop their very unique and powerful sensitivities. And then they would be mentored. So this was all very fantastic and interesting to me, but it took on a whole new level of significance when I met this young man 4 years ago named Adam.
I was always just very excited. I was just the happy kid. I was 20. It was 4 days after my 20th birthday. I went nuts. So when it first occurred, it was very fun and exciting. It was the first time I had ever experienced a real connection to the universe, where I really felt like a part of this, that I was this was me. It was just like incredible. Then I kept going, and then I went way too far, and then it got scary.
And it was terrifying. You know, it was awful, actually.
It was just kind of like a panic, I don't know, put some medication in this kid and just hope for the best. There was a point where I was taking 15 pills in a day.
And we went from one doctor to another doctor and one prescription to another prescription.
We couldn't do anything. We couldn't help him.
So after 4 years of horrible side effects, Adam just quit all his meds and he did a 10-day silent meditation retreat. Now, going off meds like that is completely not advised. It's a very dangerous thing to do. But miraculously, he stabilized and he got a job. So when I met him, it was 4 years later, and he had already done 3 meditation retreats. He was living in this beautiful little cabin on a lake. He was working at Whole Foods grocery store. And I just thought, what a wonderful documentary this will make on the power of meditation. And my main character looked like Jesus Christ. I mean, I couldn't miss. So we started filming him. I paired up with a friend of mine, and we were about 2 months into that filming when he went to do another meditation retreat, and he started having these issues. A lot of things started coming up from childhood. So he went to the leader, and he told him, and he revealed his past mental health history. And then they said, you've got to go. We can't have you here. So they sent him home. And that really hurt Adam. We could just really see how that affected him. And then after that, it was just a couple of weeks later, he became estranged from his family, who he had been very close to, when he confronted a relative who he had recently come to believe had molested him as a child. And at that point, Adam's life just completely started spinning out of control. He lost his job at Whole Foods. He became homeless. He started living in this abandoned car. He got beat up on the street, got his jaw broken in 3 places, most of his teeth kicked out. And as we just watched this poor young guy completely unfold like that, you know, we had no idea what to do. So we just started interviewing psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health workers. And that's when I first started to get a real sense of the severity of our mental health crisis here in the US. Adam isn't alone. And here's a few statistics, and this is just a few of them. 56% of our prisoners have a mental disorder of some sort. These are our new asylums. If you look at the number of people going on disability insurance right now for mental disorders, that number is almost quadrupled inside of 20 years. 1,100 people go on SSDI every day, and 300 of those are under 18 years of age. So I asked these individuals, these psychiatrists, and the psychologists, mental health workers, what is causing all this issue? And they said, there was a book that came out in the mid-'80s. It was written by Nancy Andreessen, who was the editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and in it she stated, medical science is now convinced that mental illnesses are due mainly to abnormalities in brain structure and chemistry. And even though there was a footnote in this book that followed and said, the proof to this theory will soon be coming, 30 years later, we're still waiting for that proof. But in the meantime, that theory has become embedded in the public mind, and we accept it as scientific fact. And so the research that's driven nowadays, we're looking for a better pharmaceutical, looking for that responsible neural pathway or the set of genes that we're going to hopefully be able to turn on or off someday. And this is where our research dollars are going. The other thing that happened during this time is we became much more aggressive about how we define what a mental illness is. And if you look at the DSM, which is the catalog of mental disorders, it's published by the American Psychiatric Association, and DSM-1, the first edition came out in 1952. It had 106 disorders. Well, DSM-5, the fifth edition, just came out with 365. And if you start looking at those disorders, you'll see why it expanded so much. One of them is sibling rivalry disorder. So right now, we are being accused by the European psychiatrists, rightly so, for pathologizing normal human experience. We interviewed a group of people who had been diagnosed. The only question we asked them, what was your diagnosis?
Schizophrenia, schizotypal, schizoid personality, schizoaffective, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, major depression,
homicidal ideation, bipolar, ADHD, ODD, depression and anxiety.
Manic depression, bipolar 1, and just one time schizoaffective.
In the era of the DSM-3, there were like 12 personality disorders, and I had 8 of them, and the perfectionist in me wanted to try and get all 12.
So Adam had 6 or 7 of these labels. And so all of a sudden you realize these labels that carry all this stigma just aren't that precise. If you look at what's happened since the chemical imbalance theory of mental illness has taken hold in our country, a psychiatrist, she had me take a look at this chart, and she said, just look at this and see what it tells you. And for me, I just said, yeah, we're using a lot more psychopharmaceuticals. She said, no, think in terms of responsibility. You know, what we've done in the last 30 years is shifted the responsibility of our mental health, and we've shifted it onto the backs of scientists and medical experts. She says it's much like, you know, we're waiting for the fat pill so we don't have to exercise and eat right. But what stuck out to me was the amount, this massive investment we're putting into our main treatment here. Why aren't the disability numbers coming down? Why are all these people going into our prisons? So we started looking for answers, and we put up a blog, and we continued our interviews with psychologists, the scientists, the clinicians, and other medical experts. And by the way, everyone has said medications can play an important role in recovery, as long as they're used conservatively and in conjunction with good psychological, social, and spiritual support. As we had that blog up, we started hearing from a group of people that identified themselves as part of the recovery movement. And these are people that are coming out from underneath the diagnosis and labels and meeting each other online and sharing their experiences, forming these online communities of support, which are very healing for them. And this is a movement I knew nothing about. It's growing rapidly, it's grassroots, and it's worldwide. And I just want to introduce you to one of those people in the movement.
I was diagnosed as a 14-year-old, and I was put on psychiatric drugs at that time and took them until the age of 27. Once I came to see myself as having this disease living inside of me, I stopped trusting in my intuition because it was sick. And what I did come to realize was, wait a minute, my suffering is incredibly meaningful. It's here for a reason, and I have to stop running away from it. And I realized, yeah, I have the only way to find myself again and to get back to an authentic sense of self is to feel all of this and to listen to it and to explore it and to not be afraid of it. So that's what I started to do.
So we just asked a group of these survivors, what was the thing that helped you the most in your recovery? And a couple of these answers came up over and over again. One was, you've got to believe you can recover. So many of them were told that they couldn't. They were told they had a disease that there was no cure for, and they would have to be on these meds for the rest of their life. And can you imagine being 20 years old, you're away at college, you've had a bad grade or two, maybe your boyfriend or girlfriend has dumped you, and all of a sudden you go off the rails. You're scared, you're frightened, you have no idea what's happening. You're very suggestible, you're very vulnerable. And an expert comes to you and says, you've got this incurable illness, your brain has this incurable illness, and you're going to have to be on these meds for the rest of your life. You can see how that could be somewhat self-fulfilling. And contrast that to the message that the young shaman gets. This is a growth experience. This is a tough time, yes, but we're going to help you. We're going to mentor you as you learn to manage your sensitivities. And you're going to be very valuable to the community. It's a whole different message. The other thing they said is, be sure to get support. If you found somebody that's your support and they don't believe in your recovery, just find somebody else. And, we saw what happened to Adam when he lost his support and got isolated. It was devastating to him. One of the things that they really like, the recovery people, is a thing called peer-to-peer support. Essentially, you're taking somebody who's in the middle of their mental health crisis, you're pairing them with somebody who's already made it through that crisis. It's much like the young shaman that gets the older shaman as a support system. Now, one of the things I don't want to do is leave you with an over-romanticized view of indigenous cultures, because these cultures, they have their mental health issues, and not everybody that has one can become a shaman. But they've certainly taught me a lot about the importance of community and social support and the power of belief and suggestion, especially when you're dealing with somebody in a mental health crisis. We talked to this one psychiatrist. He'd been in practice 40 years, and he said, my whole effectiveness took this quantum leap when I stopped looking for the problem and the label, and I started looking for the strengths in my patients. He said, so many of my patients have this intuitive sense, and so many of them have that experience that...
And some of the things that he mentioned about stuff like the young shaman, etc., there's actually been a push for certain people of certain theoretical orientations to really play on things like what he said, to in some cases they even mentioned the shamanism stuff in other cultures to their patients, and that sometimes is enough. Just realizing that other cultures treat things differently, sometimes this actually creates a huge change in that client, and these people might all of a sudden go off meds. or cut back their therapy, or increase their therapy for a little while and then decrease it. And this whole understanding of how different cultures treat everything is pretty remarkable. In the US, we're just quickly trying to label people one thing or another, get them on meds for potentially forever. Most people do not need to be on meds for their entire life, honestly. We're the only culture that really drives that. Most other cultures, it's a short-term thing. Then they take you off, you challenge it, and see how you go. They also provide much better support. So I challenge everybody to, as they're thinking about their friends that have illnesses, whatever mental illnesses they may have, to look and see how other cultures may experience that. Schizophrenia and many personality disorders, again, they're in, they're shamans. There might be shamans in other cultures. The same thing with anxiety problems, depression. And just making sure that first people do have that support, but also learn, again, that they still have a value. That is remarkably huge to the healing process. If anybody would like to learn a little bit more, my former therapist has a book called Potential Not Pathology. He also has a podcast of the same name, which basically he's not a big person to pathologize very much of anything. I think he only puts anything down just so insurance comes back. But he really does believe that, and a lot of there's been a lot of push for therapists to be less interested in that pathology that our culture is training us to do. So you've just heard me discuss about the whole shamanism thing. So there are a lot of things that can cause mental illness, whether it's a more permanent issue, whether it's shorter term issue, and most are short-term issues. So there are three possible causes, which we're about to get into. Those three causes are supernatural, God, spirits, witchcraft. All of those possibilities fall under that section. And shamanism can kind of fall into that too, as well, depending on. But interestingly enough, even if you do the shamanism thing, they kind of, since it tends to run in families, obviously, there might also be a little bit of a genetic issue that they may not even be acknowledging. You also see this somatogenic. That's, like I said, your genetics, some type of trauma, an actual disease may cause that as well. And psychogenic, which are those maladaptive thinkings, the cultural influences. A lot of cultural things that pop up, especially in the US, are not super helpful. So, hence, we could actually be causing some of these issues. But here, so we have different eras. We definitely have they had very, very different understandings as to what was causing all of these mental illnesses, or, well, they didn't always consider them mental illnesses, but what we think of as mental illnesses. In prehistory, they really mostly focused on the supernatural expectations. That's, your ghosts, spirits, all that type of thing. We know that they were doing this because if you look at some pretty old skulls, they had little holes drilled into them, or knocked into them, rather. They didn't quite have a drill. And this was understood to mean that they were trying to possibly release some type of extra spirit that might have gotten trapped inside this person's head or this person's body. And people often did survive this. I mean, they didn't always survive it, but we do know that many people did survive this because you could actually tell basically by healing. And given we still do a little bit of this whole trepanation, that's the drilling of the holes into the head, we do know that actually that can relieve some of the issues. We actually still do that a little bit of today. It does help relieve excessive pressure on the brain, some excessive fluid and stuff, which also can create some pretty weird behavioral changes. But in their case, they didn't know quite about that, but they did tend to think some type of spirit of some form. When we get into the ancient China, we have a little bit of everything going on. They believed still that there was some type of excessive force, but they also recognized that there was some form of somatic issue as well. They believed that you could actually push off the whole illness by basically, well, at least Confucius said that you might be able to avoid illness by training the mind. So there may have also been a little bit of psychogenic things in there too. So certain people also all did say things like, you are, the people who you hang out with can influence you and can make it better, worse, or whatnot. So some people actually did have the psychogenic stuff as well. But really, very few people actually acknowledge ancient China was doing that. Classical Greece does have a mixture, again, somatogenic and psychogenic sources. They came up with a lot of very interesting ideas for not only mental health, but physical health as well. We are going to get back to them in a little bit. You also have stuff like in the Middle Ages. By the Middle Ages, Dark Ages, whatever you want to call them, we've lost an awful lot of this knowledge that we had in classical Greece. Now we're going back to what it was before. You're thinking witches. You're thinking other phenomenon that was going on. Demons. This is when the church was getting really, really powerful. Powerful again, really. They started getting powerful, and then this is the height of their power, really. But as the Renaissance comes into, we're kind of getting rid of these whole concepts of demons and everything else like that. And we're looking again at what type of physical issues could potentially be causing the problem. And we do this still for a couple of centuries. In the 18th is right around we're starting to think that not only might there be that physical thing, we are thinking about the psychogenic stuff as well. We're getting back into looking at how other people and other cultures really are playing along with this whole thing, how certain groups can influence a person to do one thing or another. People can fall into the bad with a bad crowd. Really, you might have other things that are causing trouble. So those are all possibilities, as well. And we're really keeping with most of that in modern day. Things have improved. We have a better understanding of the specific genetics, maybe the specific neurotransmitters that are causing all of these things. And we certainly have all confirmed that cultural influence can really, really play a part. There is a book that actually one of my advisors wrote called When Culture and Biology Collide, Why We Are Stressed, Depressed, and Self-Obsessed. That was E.O. Smith. And that's really discussing all of this here and how all of these things can really play a number on our mental health and our body as well. Diagnosis. So throughout time, and depending on different cultures and so many different things, everybody had their own idea as to what was causing all of these different things. And what frequently would happen would be like a teacher teaches his students one thing, and he continues to, I say he because it usually was a guy, he taught them that. But when one of his students doesn't agree, so that student comes up with his own thing. Again, he, because it was usually male. And now they taught a completely, maybe a little bit different method, all based on whatever theory that person had. There really wasn't a whole lot of science necessarily going on in all of this, or they may have completely different understandings. So all of these, so this could cause multiple different ways for the schools of thought as to how to diagnose one thing or another. And this could cause a bit of a problem, because not only diagnosis, what are they, that could lead to different treatments. And that could be a real problem. They realized at a certain point, there's like, we have to get together and find some way of actually getting it together and just organizing our thoughts on all of these things. So the first one was in this 19th century, where they created this diagnostic manual. Was it good? Well, I mean, it was certainly a baseline for people to discuss later. I'm sure it had its critics, but it was somewhere. You have to start somewhere. And since the 1950s to now, we have this book called the DSM. It's done by the American Psychiatric Association, so not the American Psychological Association, which most people think of. It's the American Psychiatric. So 1952 to now, we have multiple editions, multiple versions. There have been 7 revisions, but 5 editions, because sometimes they did like basically, I want to say like version like maybe 3.5, 3.1, that type of thing. The most recent update was in 2013, and so now we are on the DSM-5. There's been quite a number of differences between that DSM-1, I guess they weren't calling it 1 back then, and the DSM-5, which is significantly bigger. It's got hundreds of, like something like 400, I think, options, disease options, and they're trying to clarify everything. But that is traditionally how we diagnose. If we are using insurance things, we have to diagnose according to that manual. So that is what the DSM looks like. Currently it is approximately $150 on Amazon, if anybody ever wants to use that. For people who are going into psychology, you may need one of them. I would recommend buying it used if you can, for when you start actually seeing people. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you buying one until you need to do so, because these are very, very expensive manuals, and your school will probably have a few copies of whichever the most recent manual is for you to look at. So here's a bit of the origin of DSM.
It's hard to talk about psychology for very long without mentioning the DSM, also known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's sometimes called the Psychiatry Bible, and for good reason. It's how most mental health professionals figure out if you have something they should be treating. But mental health professionals are just people, regular, fallible people who have made mistakes, especially in the early days of the field, when psychology was often based more on what sounded good than on empirical evidence. And the origin story of the DSM reveals one of the biggest ones. For a while, psychologists had a pretty limited definition of mental illness. They thought mental disorders were mostly physiological problems you were born with. And it took a couple of world wars for them to realize just how wrong they were. One of the first times anyone tried to identify people with mental illness, at least in the US, was in 1840. The census that year had a question about whether people had what it called insane or idiotic dependence. Yeah, language has changed a bit since then. The problem was the question didn't include any definitions of mental illness, so census takers kind of had to wing it. And without specific sets of symptoms to use when they were diagnosing people, doctors also had to wing it. It took until 1918 for the American Medico-Psychological Association to write the Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane, which had some of the first standardized descriptions of what counted as a disorder. It included things like manic depressive psychosis or dementia precox, which today we would call bipolar disorder and schizophrenia respectively. Since these disorders were really poorly understood at the time and there weren't great treatments for them, they were common among people who'd been institutionalized. But the manual's whole approach to mental illness was really narrow. Doctors thought these disorders came entirely from physical problems, the same way a hard knock to the head can cause the symptoms of a concussion. Today, we know bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are some of the most highly heritable mental disorders, so it makes sense that they'd think of disorders as being physical, maybe even hereditary. And it's true that mental illness can come with changes in brain chemistry, but it is not at all like a concussion. Environmental factors are incredibly important when it comes to mental health, and not considering those factors meant that doctors missed a lot. Still, the system worked okay for a while until there was a problem. A pretty big problem, in fact, kind of a worldwide problem. World War II, suddenly there were millions of soldiers returning from a war where they'd seen their friends die and witnessed some of the cruelest possible treatment of others. Meanwhile, families were split, communities were torn apart, and there was a lot of anxiety about the future of civilization in general. Many of these problems had come up in the aftermath of World War I too, but they were generally diagnosed as shell shock. Today, we call shell shock post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, but back then, doctors didn't really think of it as a mental illness. They thought it was caused by the physical effects of artillery shells on nerves, hence the name. So doctors treated it like a neurological problem, not a psychological one. It wasn't until World War II that psychologists began to realize what had once been known as shell shock might be a mental illness. They started calling it combat stress reaction and treating it as a psychological thing. The thing was, all these people had previously been pretty healthy, so the manuals weren't much help. All disorders were considered biological and lifelong. There were no categories describing problems that developed in response to some life event. So the American Psychological Association, or APA, decided to write a new guide. But first, they went looking for some help understanding what was happening to people. What they found was detailed in the inauspiciously titled War Department Technical Bulletin Medical 203, a document published in 1943 that tried to explain how disorders could emerge from stressful life events. It was written by a committee chaired by a military psychiatrist, but it relied a whole lot on the theories of Sigmund Freud. And I don't know if you heard of the guy, but there are some things he kind of didn't get right about how people work, like almost everything. But he saw patients after World War I, and he had an explanation for why they experienced shell shock and why not everyone did. The symptoms of shell shock were very similar to symptoms of what Freud called a neurosis, which he thought was caused by childhood trauma and the repressed emotions or complexes that came from it. The idea was that if something was too stressful to think about, it would be pushed into your unconscious mind and then show itself through other anxieties or troubling behaviors. It was also hard to tell if trauma was the real reason for the symptoms of neurosis, since by definition the memories might be repressed. But in the case of shell shock, it was obvious what the trauma was. So this War Department memo used Freud's ideas to explain how life circumstance could lead to a combat stress reaction in someone who didn't have a history of mental illness. There were so many patients who fit the description that when the APA started to write the first edition of the DSM, which was published in 1952, these ideas became a major theme. They copied several passages verbatim from the War Department memo, including some about how disorders could be reactions to social factors or the environment. Also like the memo, the first edition of the DSM divided disorders into neurotic, psychotic, and character disorders, in addition to disorders that had a known physiological cause. The DSM has been through a lot since. Removing some of Freud's theories for how disorders developed was one of the first orders of business, and today's DSM-5 focuses much more on just describing and categorizing symptoms. But we've kept some of the key lessons from the DSM's origin story, that disorders can have environmental and social causes, not just biological ones, and that mental illnesses can be much broader than what you'd find in an early 20th century mental hospital. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych. For more on the strange and sometimes awful history of psychology, along with all kinds of other videos about our weird human brains, you can go to youtube.com/SciShowPsych to subscribe.
Don't worry, this isn't the exact same slide as you had before. But again, different eras did have different understandings. As we mentioned, trepanation for prehistory to see if we could get those spirits out of whatever we had in your head. They also, for ancient China, in that case, they were really looking at this whole concept of yin and yang. Basically, I don't know how they calculated it. Ancient China is not my area. They had, you could have too much yin, and then you would need some yang to get yourself back in balance. And this whole concept of having too much of one and not the other caused a whole variety of things, mental illness, physical illness, etc. There are still those that also are still using some of this information today, even though it has pretty much been disproven. But people are still doing stuff like that today. You also, sometimes they don't necessarily say yin and yang, sometimes it's hot or cold or something like that. But the whole understanding is still the same. By the time we get to classical Greece and ancient Egypt, we're starting to look into, as I mentioned, they have some understandings of the body at this point. And sometimes they're thinking different things are coming together in ways that doesn't seem to make sense. For example, an awful lot of things in ancient Greece they believed had something to do with the uterus wandering about. So for those people who have a uterus, the odds of your uterus wandering around is realistically pretty low. But they believed that the uterus was going all sorts of places, up and down your body. I don't really know how they really got this idea, but that was one of their things. So any type of problem could go back and be fixed by just getting the uterus back in place wherever it needed to be, wherever it was coming from. Around this time, somewhat similar to the whole yin-yang thing with ancient China, we have the four humors, and basically every problem has something to do with which type of humor you've got. That's too much of one, too little of the other. You have basically stuff like different colors of bile, different colors of phlegm, blood. It gets a little bit confusing, but then that's why you needed to be a really good doctor to know which thing you had too much of or too little of. A little bit of this four humor thing would continue on, but like if you have ever heard of someone who had to be bled for something, like they had a fever and they had to be bled, they were still doing that in the 18th century. So, but this is where that understanding first came from. Middle Ages, for people who are very familiar of things like the burning times, right? Earlier than some of these things are going on, but still close enough. People thought everything was basically witchcraft. They figured if they found the witches, killed them, or did whatever, problem would solve itself. A lot of people ended up being victims that probably had very, very little to do with anything. Sometimes it was just an old, maybe an old woman who happened to know a little bit about herbal medicine. She might get the blame. But people were really, really scared of stuff like witchcraft. And they would see and people would say they've seen all sorts of weird things. Now, interestingly enough, in the Middle Ages, there was a time period that a lot of pagans call the burning times, basically when they were burning all these witches. And during this time, interestingly, there was actually something going on in the crops. There was like a fungus or something, had contaminated crops. And if you ate these contaminated crops, you would possibly see things. you would get sick. Instead of knowing that it had something to do with the crops, the fungus, they took whatever they saw and decided it was the witches. Eventually, things did clear up, and and the fungus died off naturally. So eventually, so did the witch hunt. Quite literally, the witch hunt. So, but no, that was really, really big still in that time period. Also looking for demons of any form, spirits, possession, all that type of thing. 16th century, you still are getting some stuff like that. It is getting at least better. And what happens is that we are starting to really start to get a little bit more into potential understanding, because this is around the time the Renaissance starts. And sorry here, all right there. But people in this time, you also start developing a little bit about little type of institutions for people who have challenges. So you'll sometimes see that there. Not necessarily mental health issues, but also sometimes having lower than average, IQ, intellectual type of disabilities, and that type of thing as well. So there were a lot of things that started definitely going on there. And 18th, when we're looking at the 18th century, people started to think that maybe we should treat mentally ill people a little bit better. Because realistically, in the 16th century, even if they were separated, it still wasn't usually a really great thing. So at this time, you're looking at, this translates out to basically moral treatment. You should try to treat these people better. And sometimes it was better and sometimes not. So, but they were at least trying at this point. They also believe that by acting right, kind of a little bit like acting righteous, you were also going to, basically remain pure enough, and you wouldn't get some illnesses. They had a lot of things going on here, a lot of things that we've pretty much kicked out most of today. And nowadays, with all of this, we have a lot of stuff like psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, lots of forms of medication. And medications are just huge in this country. And we also have the DSM, which we've already mentioned. So basically, as we know more about the causes, we have altered the treatments, obviously. And what we consider humane has also influenced treatments as well. It wasn't that long ago that people would even go to basically a mental hospital and pay to be entertained by the patients. It would be like going to the zoo nowadays, or going to an amusement park. They'd go have a picnic at the asylum. And that's realistically not super humane. So there's also just not just treatments, but just as far as the actual how you're trying to treat the disorder, but just that type of behavior as well. And we're going to, of course, the more we learn, we move our understanding forwards, of course. So we have a thing. So here is a look inside the closed doors of a mental hospital. Well, at this point, it was an insane asylum. So here you go.
What is lunacy? What is insanity? In the 19th century, many tried to answer these questions. Some thought lunatics were people who lacked reason, but were conscious of their surroundings. Others believed lunacy occurred when blood wasn't reaching the brain. There were those who even said that when lunatics were violent, it was just nature's way of releasing excess energy. Perhaps the best definition comes from Dr. William Neville, who wrote that insanity was a generic What is lunacy? What is insanity? In the 19th century, many tried to answer these questions. Some thought lunatics were people who lacked reason, but were conscious of their surroundings. Others believed lunacy occurred when blood wasn't reaching the brain. There were those who even said that when lunatics were violent, it was just nature's way of releasing excess energy. Perhaps the best definition comes from Dr. William Neville, who wrote that insanity was a generic word applied to functional derangement of the brain under extremely diversified and often even opposite behaviors. Regardless of the definition used, we know that the insane were sent to asylums. In France, a law was introduced in 1838 which allowed for the committal of the insane by their family or by prefects. In New York, in 1866, laws were passed that required that an insane person be sent by their family members to a state lunatic asylum. Asylums were supposed to treat and cure the insane through medical and moral treatments. But what happened behind closed doors? Look at the women committed to these asylums, and you find a different picture. The asylums contain women who had dared to question and disagree with their husbands over Christian ideology. Women whose families thought they had expressed too much grief, or too little. They had all challenged social norms through their actions or mere presence. Not only that, but the asylums frequently abused their patients, beating and whipping them. Investigations found patients living in squalor, naked and chained in their rooms. What were these asylums meant for then? Were asylums supposed to be treating the insane, or silencing those who challenged the status quo? Although there had been ways to handle the insane for centuries, asylums only came into existence in the 1800s. According to Sir William Charles Ellis, who ran county asylums for over 20 years and was knighted for his work, in England in 1838, there were 12,668 impoverished lunatics and idiots, and at least 10,000 insane people. We can recreate Hanwell, an asylum in Middlesex, from his treatise on insanity and the management of asylums. County asylums usually contain both men and women, placed in two different sections of the asylum. Men were treated and examined by the physician and house surgeon. For women, it was the matron and the surgeon's wife or a trained female physician. The patients had sleeping apartments at least 8 feet 6 inches long and 6 feet 9 inches wide, where they would sleep without clothes, and if epileptic, restrained so that they could not injure themselves. During the daytime, patients received medical and moral treatments. Ellis wrote that the most essential ingredient is constant, never tiring, watchful kindness. As the century went on, patients began to be employed within the asylum. Men often were taught some type of mechanical labor, such as shoemaking, while women made clothing. Patients made the beer and bread and helped with the laundry. Ellis wrote that it gave meaning to their lives as well as teaching them skills for life after the asylum. Out of the 612 patients in Hanwell, 454 were involved in work. The other 148 were mostly fatuous or physically unable to work. The few who were unwilling to work would be given no indulgences, such as beer. From 19th century advertisements, we also have information on a private asylum for upper-class women, Elms Courthouse. Compared to county asylums, private asylums had far more space for each patient, and the Elms Courthouse included sitting rooms, parlors, and even an aviary for foreign birds. These women would never work. Instead, they did calisthenic exercises, a type of rhythmic movement. The women would be treated with gentility and kindness befitting their station, to remind them what it meant to be a lady. But on closer examination, one can see the stigma which was attached to madness. The house's name avoids words like lunatic and asylum, and instead describes itself as a house for the nervously affected, and a place for ladies laboring under affections of the mind. The reviews emphasize its seclusion, and that only the immediate attendant would know the full details of the lady's illness. The ground map specifically mentions the 14-foot high brick wall, which would surround the whole island, blocking anyone from viewing into it. Any behavior which would threaten the family name would be silenced within these walls. What afflicted the people who were committed to these asylums? Ledgers from asylums can give us a clue. They had head injuries, epilepsy, convulsions. In an ideal world, the basis for their committal would be insane behaviors and mannerisms. But the records of why women were committed show that other reasons often had a social or political narrative.
I was studied into the cause of her disease of the nervous system, and so far as I can judge, it was caused by her disregarding the laws of her nature as a woman. If women would have resolution enough to be quiet at such times as nature and reason both dictate, they would be relieved of a vast amount of suffering, which is inseparably connected with us trifling with this law of our nature.
One analyst claimed that male psychiatrists detected signs of mental illness when women acted in a way that did not embody female domesticity. According to another source, marriage diminished susceptibility to mental alienation for women. In 19th century France, the bourgeois feared women rejecting the secular and religious values of society. Women who criticized political men would be committed. The medical term for this was politicomania. There were also many instances in which female anatomy and sexuality are used to commit women to lunatic asylums. For example, Dr. Neville believed that women went insane because of the suppression of habitual bodily discharge in relation to that of female organs. He even noted that it was the maternal womb that caused mania and imbecility. In fact, the womb was very important when discussing female insanity. Some people thought that women were taken over by their devouring womb, which destroyed their mental health. So there was a general consensus that women had powerful nervous systems and uteri. Even masturbation was considered more alarming in women than in men. In fact, prostitution was linked with erotomania. In this way, female sexuality was thus silenced. It was socially controlled. These reasons show that often women were at the mercy of social norms. Defiance of these social norms led to the committal of normal women into insane asylums. Now let's take a look at the conditions and treatment within the asylums. Unfortunately, not all asylums were morally operated. Reports of neglect and abuse, often delivered by investigative exposés of undercover journalists, were common in state asylums that housed criminals or patients labeled incurable and beyond hope of rehabilitation. Bad economic turns were especially unfortunate for the mentally ill, as they were generally considered the least deserving when it came to appropriating tax dollars. Women who were committed by their husbands as an alternative to divorce often became even more unbalanced during their stay. Nellie Bly, an undercover journalist who stayed 10 days within the Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum, had this to say about her treatment. Expecting torture would produce insanity quicker than this treatment? Here's a class of women sent to be cured. I would like the expert physicians who are condemning me for my action, which has proven their ability to take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up, and make her sit from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. on straight backbenches. Do not allow her to talk or move during these hours. Give her no reading, and let her know nothing of the world or its doings. Give her bad food and harsh treatment, and see how long it will take to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and physical wreck. Penniless people and those of criminal nature were often kept within cold and gloomy rooms, not much more comfortable than prison cells. These damp and filthy conditions were generally overcrowded and conducive to the rampant spread of disease. Heavy metal chains and iron cages were used to restrain easily excited patients, and if they were given beds, they were typically made of animal hair, infested with bugs and body lice. The male staff members of asylums were chosen for their brute strength and often had no medical knowledge. Patients who misbehaved or grew rowdy were quickly and harshly restrained. Patients were cuffed, strapped to restrictive wooden chairs, placed in straitjackets, chained to walls and each other, and often beaten or lashed. To many, the purpose of an asylum was to confine and conceal the insane, to protect their friends and family from the inconvenient embarrassment of their mental disabilities. According to Dr. William Brown, a well-published American psychiatrist, regarded as wild beasts, all maniacs were indiscriminately treated as such. Nay, the imprisoned tiger enjoys a milder fate, for his keepers have an interest in his health and preservation. Instead, incurable asylum patients were constrained without treatment or happiness, terrified, beaten, or starved into obedience, and gagged, verbally abused, and taunted by nurses. Female patients were more likely than male patients to refuse food, and were commonly forced to eat. Reports tell gruesome tales of spoon handles being used to pry a bound woman's throat open, teeth broken or pulled out to better facilitate food, and the head pried backwards to such a dangerous angle that the vertebrae was often dislocated. In an 1812 report, a surgeon visiting a private New York asylum declared that he had seen a harmless woman patient locked down with a wooden crib and horsewhipped, and he had seen her blood flow in rivers. He also reported that female patients were at the mercy of their keepers' lusts, as male attendants all had keys to the women's bedrooms. The treatment of the mentally disabled certainly varied from asylum to asylum, and factors such as class and gender greatly impacted these variations. Public asylums were government-funded and housed the poorest members of society, and thus often the poorest living conditions. Private asylums were a toss-up. Some were targeted at the upper class and built to act as gentle retreats of rehabilitation, while other private asylums sought to maximize profit and operated without having to meet the already low standards of the government. Undoubtedly, many asylums treated the poorest and lowest of society as worse than animals. In the 19th century, the central question was this: were asylums used to help the mentally ill, or did they shield the status quo from dissenters? The controversy that surrounded 19th century mental asylums, whether they were there to help patients or to confine and conceal
Personally,
them
I think
from
that
public
is an
view.
excellent research project that they did there. The only thing I can think of is they should also have added a few some of the more interesting treatments that they had when people were discussing the various women's issues and masturbation. Because going back to that whole wandering uterus type of thing with in the ancient Greeks, in the 19th century, yes, some issues were thought to be related to basically women actually having some type of needs that were not being fulfilled by their husbands. Likewise, they couldn't also masturbate because that wasn't allowed, and the doctors couldn't really masturbate their patients, but that was the cure. So the long and the short of it is some people might have heard that the vibrator was created for as a medical device, and that's actually pretty true. It was done to allow the doctors to see more hysterical patients who needed to be masturbated, basically. And this was much faster that way. It was really strange, but that it really is what why the vibrators are invented. So, interesting facts. So the current trends in the U.S. are we do still have mental hospitals. We don't call them insane asylums anymore, luckily. Some people still do, but that's really not what we're supposed to be calling them. But there is a pressure towards shorter hospital stays. Part of this is due to things like insurance, only allowing the people to stay for a short amount of time. And then the people get kicked out to the streets or whatever. Sometimes they really do get kicked out to the streets, which is why sometimes you see an awful lot of homeless people that may have psychological challenges. And quite frankly, living on the streets doesn't make that any easier. You also see things that are partial inpatient programs. Maybe you go in, you check into a hospital for whatever, 6 to 7 hour stay, whatever it is, but you then go home that night. So you are having basically an intensive experience, but you're coming back. But all of this does link to that whole dehospitalization, deinstitutionalization type of thing going on, whether it's great or not great, that's up for a lot of other people to decide. Certainly, one would think for many people it would be more humane. For some people, maybe not, because especially what if they don't have a place to go back to. Another current trend in the U.S. is that we are really, really dependent on medication. We are pretty much the only country that does this, but 40 billion, it's like a $40 billion industry for psychiatric drugs in the U.S. alone. But no other country has it quite like this. Most of them do take the medication as a much shorter term situation. Then they trial you to see if you can go off of it, assuming you were ever put on it in the first place. Other places are much more prone to using things like therapy instead. Here, again, insurance will also only allow you to maybe have a certain amount of therapy, depending on how good your mental health coverage is. A lot of places only do that 8 to 12, and then that's it. So everything really, really depends. So the insurance companies basically think it's cheaper for you to be on meds than for them to pay for the insurance, pay for the therapy. There's also another current trend that therapists are stopping the whole insurance thing because, quite frankly, they don't feel, some of them don't feel right kicking their patients off or telling their patients that might really need them, you can't see me anymore. Also, given the insurance reimbursement is actually very, very low, an LPC in South Carolina that I went to, he was only getting $40 an hour in total for 45 minutes. He was billing at, he was supposed to be billing at like 120 or something like that. But and then they had to keep challenging to say I could stay, and they would much rather put me on medication. Luckily, I did fail a whole bunch of medications because medications are not the answer for everything. And just enough time with him and another therapist, as well as the introduction of solution-focused therapy towards me that was more targeted, and introduction to places like hypnotherapy and that type of thing. I'm not on any medication, which is one of the reasons I do some of the things that I do and did decide to go into psychology, because I want the U.S. to be as good, has a good mental health coverage as everybody else, and that is really medications for the most part not the way you're going to go for that one. So here are your discussion questions. Using a somatogenic perspective, propose some reasons that trepidation may have been an effective agent of change in some cases of problematic behaviors or sudden illness. Why is it important to have a shared reference manual? What are the disadvantages? What institutions have a vested interest in a standardized manual? Psychology has only recently come into its own as a mature science. What would the future hold? How can our past inform us to make good decisions as our understanding continues to evolve? As always, if you have any questions, please send me an email or leave a comment. See you next time.